One, two, three, four.
You are listening to SKYLIT, the SKYLIT Books podcast. SKYLIT Books is a general interest bookstore in the Los Feliz neighborhood in Los Angeles. You can shop with us from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. or visit us online 24/7 at skylitbooks.com. Follow along at SKYLIT Books Instagram and Twitter. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening, and now on to the episode. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast, and I'm your host, Natalie Freeman. Today, we're so thrilled to welcome Darrel J. McLeod to read from his new memoir, Peyakow, Reclaiming Cree Dignity, and to talk to me about it. Before I introduce him, I wanted to remind you that SKYLIT Books is open for in-store browsing, and you can always shop online 24/7 at www.skylitbooks.com. Darrel J. McLeod is the author of Peyakow and Mama Scotch, which received the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction. He is Cree from Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta. Before deciding to pursue writing in his retirement, McLeod was a chief negotiator of land claims for the federal government and executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nations. He holds degrees in French literature and education from the University of British Columbia, and he lives in Sook, British Columbia. Thank you for being here today, Darrel.
Oh, thank you for hosting and chatting with me. Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you. Did you want to start by reading a little something from Peyakow for us?
Sure. I'm just going to start with my own intro of myself in Cree, which I always do, our tradition. So, Darrel is Peyakow, Waheo Tinia, Amis Wachiwas Kahikano Tinia, Worthadora Negawi, Sunny Clifford Notawi. So I just told you where I'm from, and my mother's name, my father's name. That's what we always. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
So I'm going to read to you from just a wee bit from the last chapter of Peyakow. It's called Kichigami, and which sort of means big water. So in this section of the book. This section, the last chapter was actually based on two amazing dreams that I had. And they were the type of dreams that you have to get up and write down before you forget. And so in this section, all of my family, I think this dream was oddly inspired by Gabriel Marquez's book, 100 Years of Solitude. And I think that book gave my brain, although dreams don't need permission to do anything, permission to imagine that all of my relatives that had lived for the last 200 years came to visit. So I was having a birthday, and I would have been passing the birthday alone that year. But in my dream, the night before my birthday, all of my relatives came to visit. And they were all gathered. I have a little acreage here by the Salish Sea, and across from the Olympic Mountains, actually, very close to the U.S. And so my relatives all came, and we were all sitting around talking in a blend of Cree and English. From my mother's generation up, they spoke Cree fluently, and my grandparents' generation up only spoke Cree and English. So there's some translating going on, but a lot of discussion. So Kokom means grandmother in Cree. So Kokom, of course, was here. Kokom cleared her throat and continued. Once the Muniawak means the white people, once the Muniawak outnumbered us, they tore apart our culture one piece at a time, outlawed powwows and gatherings, our form of government, took our kids away when they were still really small and taught them English. They brought French-speaking nuns and priests to teach it to them, along with their religion. They hardly spoke English, those people, and never used it between themselves. Spoke Francais, so forced us to end our seasonal migration from the northern bush to the Rocky Mountains. but as whiskey is what they want boy, so it ruined us. A real bad dream, too bad to be true. She glanced around the room. We didn't have no heaven or hell before they came, and we weren't ashamed of our own nakedness. We enjoyed sex and talked about it freely. We didn't hide it away in darkness, and we didn't have VD. Their men brought that too. We ate good. Nobody was fat or had diabetes, and we knew how to laugh. A good belly laugh that healed us and kept us going. Then there was quiet. I remembered this type of silence when we were content just to be together and sit there happy with life. After a while, Mushroom spoke to Mother in Cree. She turned to me. He wants you to tell us about your travels, my man. I told him that you have traveled to many places. I didn't know where to start, so I began with Three Sisters Mountains at Canmore, near Banff National Park. How I traveled to them at the age of 10. They'd become my surrogate grandmothers. Mushroom know there were Cree names for those mountains. Then the beauty of British Columbia. I couldn't settle on one place, so I described the other rocky and coastal mountains. How I loved the waterfalls that adorned them like diamond necklaces, rivers, streams, mineral hot springs, lakes and oceans, magnificent forests of cedar and spruce. I told my family how nature had healed me and given me new vigor right there at my little house near Souk. I told them about Mexico, the jungle, warm ocean, masses of cinnamon-colored faces, mangoes and coconuts, the Huichol people. During the spring and fall equinoxes, the setting sun turned a shadow on the steps of Chichen Itza into an illusion of a Mayan deity, a feathered serpent, slithering down its banisters. The Aztecs called that same deity Quetzalcoatl, god of wind and rain, of knowledge and learning. I described how the Mapuche and other peoples of Argentina had welcomed me, shared their ceremonies and feasts. Muslim turned to Mother, shook his head, nodded in my direction, and said, Ma, Soswa, Peyakow. He can't believe you did all those travels alone, son. You took our spirit to all those places, alone.
I'm so glad you chose that chapter to read, and it wasn't going to be my first discussion point, but I think I'll start here now. Was about how Peyakow in Cree is one who walks alone. And although these chapters of your life and your career that this book focuses on were really spent alone, I noticed the through line of all of the family and ancestors that were with you and visiting you throughout these chapters of your life at this time. And part of me felt like you weren't quite alone in many ways. And maybe that's reading into it or your realization after the fact, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that.
Could you just repeat the one sec? You broke up a little bit there.
Yeah, just that even though Peyakow translates to the one who walks alone,
Right.
you didn't seem to be alone through a lot of this chapter of your life. And maybe that's something that you realized after the fact, after a lot of these dreams occurred, but I noticed that through line and that dichotomy there. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Right. Well, this may sound funny, but alone, I guess, is a relative term. And I'm not trying to play on words there either, but compared to how I would have lived had our life not be disrupted, where I'm from, I say that colonization was rapid and brutal and really disrupted our extended family and nuclear family and individual lives. So when I was a child, a wee child, a toddler, I lived in a community that was just made up of my relations, my people. And we were always surrounded by warm, loving brown faces. And but that community was uh, we were forced to relocate, so it was disrupted. And then, in my the disruption and trauma caused as that resulted from the disruption really destroyed my immediate family. So I've had so many deaths in my family that I often feel alone. One of my closest people was my sister, my oldest sister, Debbie, who I write about in Mama Scotch. And she passed away fairly young, tragically. and so did two of my other siblings pass away at fairly young ages. And normally, my house, if this was, if this was a normal situation for my family, there would be all kinds of kids running around right now
Yeah.
disrupting my conversation and making noise, and I'd have to say, "Be quiet, YOE, go outside," that kind of thing. But here I am alone, and I have to say, I love it. Solitude is a real big part of Cree culture.
Yeah.
Elders would often go into the woods on their own, both women and men. Women would go to their camp by themselves for a month to 3 months at a time in the summertime, and they would, of course, take the rifle and all the equipment they had to for hunting and sustenance, that kind of thing. But so it's a mixed bag, and I would have been alone a lot of deliberately and by choice, traditionally in my traditional culture. Unfortunately, in this phase of my life and for the last, many of my adult years, I have been alone. I've lived alone. I haven't been in a successful, loving relationship for many reasons, and I do so many things alone. I do probably 60% of the activities in my life alone. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. And as I've said in other interviews, it didn't mean that I wasn't accompanied
Mhm.
by loving people and that I wasn't loved, because I'm very loved. I'm very fortunate, more now than ever, that people have gotten to know me, and I've reconnected with so many people from different stages of my life since the release of my book, Mama Scotch, right from grade school, from primary school, grade 1 to grade 9 to my university days. And actually 2 weeks ago, a man I taught grade 4 to, uh, 30 some years ago, came to visit me, and we're going to actually have a wonderful reunion at the end of August of that class I taught grade 4 to all those years ago. So, you know, it's a mixed thing. It's just there is a sadness in my current solitude, um, but I do experience a lot of love and support for sure.
And the on the topic of re-engaging with people from the past and reconnecting, um, a part of the book that I found at least connected to me, and I felt like it was a very universal thing, maybe happening right now, but always happening, was at the very beginning when you said, "Why was I making this drastic change in my life? Was I trying to rebuild my connection with Cree culture after losing my only bridge to it, my mother? Or was I trying to get back to my roots, or simply more escapism?" And I feel like that's something a lot of people are constantly trying to do. And especially now, as people try and understand their cultures and where they came from, so that we can stop appropriating other cultures, especially yours, and find out what our own roots are, and just understanding the reasoning behind that. Is it an escapism? Are we trying to get away from ourselves? Or are we trying to find out more about who we are?
Yeah, I know there are a lot of, in Mama Scotch as well as Peyakow, there are a lot of themes that were universal type themes that many people relate to. And I had people, you know, teens, early teens, late teens, people in their 30s, 40s, up to a woman who was 106 years old, come and speak to me about my book and how it the impact it had on them. And that was so beautiful. And we are in humanity, because of globalization, which is, I think, irreversible unless the universe decides to take matters in hand and slow it all down. And I think with COVID, that did slow the globalization down a bit. But we are all faced with those questions more than ever before, I think, about what is meaningful in our lives. And in my life, certainly Nehiyaw or Cree culture is a centerpiece of what's important to me, increasingly actually as I get older. And that and writing and music are key elements. And I think for me it was you know, a bit of escapism, because I was feeling that I was getting absorbed into a culture that I didn't understand. Wasn't necessarily that I didn't like it. There were many aspects of it that I did like. I was living in an affluent part of Vancouver, um, teaching kids from affluent families, and I had been accepted by their parents and by the kids. They were wonderful and caring, and so were the teachers I worked with and the administrators and all of that. And I had a partner at the time who was also wonderful and caring, but I just felt I was being swept into this lifestyle that I didn't completely relate to, and and I wasn't sure where I would end up, and I was so afraid of losing some of the aspects of life that had grounded me, my culture, Cree language, my immediate family, and my extended family, because I'd lost touch with most of them. And lost touch, I mean, I hadn't been in touch with them for a number of years and hadn't been going home regularly. I'm back in touch, fortunately, with my extended family and siblings. But we're going to a place I dream of it. This won't happen in my lifetime, but I dream of a time when, there will emerge eventually a Canadian race and a North American race with all the wonderful genetic blending we're having happening right now. And I see it as wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled by the waves of immigration, and I think it's brought such richness to North America, and it's certainly enhanced my life. I've had kindness, from people of East Indian descent, from people from Chinese descent, people from African descent that I didn't ever experience before they started migrating to Canada in larger numbers. And when I say kindness, I mean in really practical ways too. In business, for example, at one point in my life, I was turned down by a mortgage by two lovely white ladies who worked at the bank, and I had all of the reasons to be approved for a mortgage, and I had been pre-approved by that same bank previously, and I'd held a mortgage with them. And I went across this, so I was frustrated. I went across the street to this other bank, and there was this lovely woman of East Indian descent, Canadian, and she still had, she's maybe first generation. Um, and within half an hour, I had a pre-approved mortgage for more than I needed. And that's just one small example. And
Yeah.
then I did follow up with the original bank, and of course, the president for Western Canada ended up apologizing. Then they wanted to give me a mortgage and all that kind of stuff. But, that's just one small example. But there will eventually be this race. And I hope that there's more cooperation between newcomers to North America and, well, even uh, cultures that have been here for a few generations now. I
Yeah.
hope we can build more bridges with those cultures and Indigenous culture, because we need to support each other. Indigenous people, particularly with all that's going on right now, I think I'm only speaking from my own perspective, but I think we really need the support and the understanding and the love from newer populations that have come to North America.
Well, and a lot of that support and those things, I too believe and hope that they will come about, and a lot of that will be thanks to a lot of the work that you personally have done, work that you
Mm,
talk about in Peyakow. And I wanted to talk to you about, there's so many there, how many years, 30 plus years you kind of cover in the book of your career at
mhm.
that time. And there are so many things we could talk about, but I want everyone to go and read it. So there was one specifically that really stuck out to me. And I wanted to start by where you start the book in 1899, with the signing of Treaty 8. And then so you can tell us a little bit about that. And then also how that signing of that treaty and how it affected your people, that colonization, and the genocide of the Cree population, and how that incident led to the kind of work that you wanted to do and the work that you did end up doing, and what doing it did for you and how it helped you reconcile those acts.
Right. That's quite a big question, a
Yes, it's
comprehensive
a.
question. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
And very well formulated.
Thank you.
I'd an earlier draft of Peyakow, the manuscript, didn't have that first chapter about Treaty 8, but I have a very astute editor who's become a friend, and she felt there was a gap at the beginning, and she was right. And I did know and have in mind that I wanted to include a chapter of historical nonfiction
Mhm.
um, in my book, as I did in Mama Scotch, where I talked about my mother and aunts escaping from residential school as teenagers, and that was based on stories my mother had told me. So I knew I wanted to include historical fiction, nonfiction, I should say, and I knew it was valid to do that because I had researched it and talked to friends who are experts in that area, and that, we own the memories and the experiences of our ancestors.
Mhm.
It's ours to work with, and we live it, we embody it, and we experience it, whether we want to or not. It's a key part, a central part of who we are. So I felt it was completely valid to write the historical part. And for me, it was really important to start with Treaty 8 because that's where our world really got disrupted. I mean, it's a funny and bizarre history even before the negotiation of Treaty 8, where a king in a remote land um, decided he wanted to own North America. So he got his team together, and I'm really simplifying this, but this really is as simple as it was.
Yeah.
Got his team together of scribes and lawyers and whatever else, and wrote a declaration that North America was his. And then just with his official seal, and well, that's a good
And
slip of the
steel.
tongue.
Yes.
His official seal, North America was his. But then he didn't know what to do with it. And he had a distant cousin named Rupert, who was a prince in Germany, who was, languishing and unpopular with his family in Germany. Prince Rupert came to visit, and the king decided to give him North America for a birthday present. So he did. So we had 200 years of Rupert's land, where North America was basically administered by a board of directors in England. It wasn't created as a country or established as a country with a constitution and laws. It was just governed as an enterprise for 200 years. And that didn't disrupt our culture and community and people too much because the numbers of newcomers were small still at that point, and they basically got integrated and assimilated into Cree culture, which was really neat. And they just wanted to make some money. They didn't want to usurp the land at that stage. The Hudson's Bay Company and the fur traders and all that. But then the gold rush happened in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, and that was very invasive and intrusive. And so these people came up from the south of southern part of North America and kind of invaded Canada, and there was no rule of law, nothing to control it, or even though it was really an illegal act. And so there was just lawlessness, violence, and incredible disruption on all the main waterways where the gold rush, the prospectors were were advancing. And so the government of Canada realized they had to do something. And so Treaty 8 was negotiated for all the wrong reasons, really. It was negotiated to usurp the land from the people and open up the West for exploration, for mineral exploration. And at about the same time, it was more subtle than the gold rush, but there was an increasing awareness of the oil industry, the petroleum industry. And unfortunately, where I'm from is one of the richest spots in North America for oil and gas. And so that was kind of underlying it all too. So basically, this commission appointed by the federal government in 1899 finally made an appearance. They made it to where my people are from, northern, sort of central to northern Alberta, and imposed this treaty that they had written in advance. It took 2 days. It was 2 days of meetings, and and there were linguistic problems. There had to be linguistic problems. I read the diaries, the notes, the journals of some of the commissioners and some of the lay people who were on the trip, and even of some of the religious people, because the church accompanied the state on this trip to help convince uh, the savages that they should sign on to this treaty. And so um, that is when the disruption really started. The 200 years of Rupert's Land, yeah, I mean, there was trading and it did change our culture a bit, introduced alcohol and more Western foods. But the Treaty 8, with the advent of Treaty 8, we were forced onto reserves. Some families were forced onto reserves. Others were promised lands that would be held in, was called held in severalty, a joint ownership type of situation. Um, some families got reserve lands, some got lands in severalty, many families got nothing. They kind of fell between the cracks of those two mechanisms that the government was going to use. And many were forcefully relocated. And that was the case with my family. We were forcefully relocated. And that's where that's why I say where I'm from, colonization was rapid and brutal. Because that isn't that long ago. 1899, in the big
No,
scheme of things, isn't that long ago.
it's not.
And we're still kind of getting our bearings in terms of, for example, people would ask me, well, your mother's generation, based on what they read in Mama Scotch and other stories that they had heard, well, why didn't your mother and your aunts and other relatives go for counseling? And first of all, it wasn't available at the time.
Yeah.
Secondly, the disruption was so rapid and so massive that everybody was, traumatized. Everybody was suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
It was normal then. Everybody was suffering and screwed up and injured and damaged and confused and trying to make sense of the world because the disruption was so quick. Um, so I really wanted people. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of education about Indigenous issues in the schools of North America at any level,
Mhm.
primary, intermediate, high school, or college or university level. And so people don't understand that they think that this is ancient history. Why are we still going on about it? Why are we still even talking about that? Happened hundreds of years ago, and that involved our far gone our distant ancestors.
Yeah.
But that isn't the case. It was recent.
And you mentioned the stories that your mother told you about the schools, which was the sort of one example that I wanted to have you talk to me about was your work
Oh, right, yes.
in the federal treaty office
Right, yes.
in the late 90s, because when you were working specifically on a modern treaty and land claim with the Nuchanuth people, and at the start you believed that there wouldn't be any meaningful concessions made about the legacy of the residential schools there. It wasn't supposed to really be a part of that process. And then it sort of became a very big part of that process. And the reason I wanted to talk about this specific example and part of your career was that apology that you listed in full in the book that did end up getting read by the Canadian government in 2000 was, I think I read it maybe 3 or 4 times.
Mm.
Because, and your examples as you broke it up about people's reactions in the room when they heard it for the first time and the impact that it had on people, because no apology like that had ever been written. You didn't expect any sort of apology like that. No one had ever taken accountability on that scale. And you wondered then also, if anything, what might it change in the grand scheme of things. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that experience. And it did last almost 20 years, that whole process, from the start of that treaty negotiation to the final appeal, which also ended with a conservative government in Canada wiping out a lot of that progress. And so if you could tell us a little bit about your time there and that part of your career, and then I have another follow-up question about it too.
Sure. That links to sort of the last part of your previous question. My experience I wasn't trained, I was trained as an educator, and I thought I'd be an educator my whole life, and I love that field. But I was recruited by the federal government to work on treaties, um, sort of fairly early in my career. And that perspective, so I had to study, on my own, uh, Canadian government policy, all the historical aspects of the treaties that had been in. There are historic treaties, numbered treaties, and peace and friendship treaties. I had to learn about all of that, not only in British Columbia but in the whole country. And so I just immersed myself in information about all of those things, and it gave me a phenomenal perspective. And then meeting face to face with the New Channel people who had never negotiated a treaty. Most of British Columbia hasn't been, the Indigenous rights haven't been settled here. Um, and because British Columbia came into Confederation under false pretenses, but that's a whole other story that
Yeah.
will come out in the future. Um, but it made me look, it was kind of like holding up a mirror to me to be faced with all this. So I studied the history of Treaty 8 as part of my other work. And I got to see how, I mean, the document itself, when I got it, I mean, I remember sending a note to one of my claim analysts to get me a copy of Treaty 8. So I get it, and it's like one page.
I was gonna say, I'm sure it was
What?
like one page.
Yeah. Maybe it was 2 pages, but I was just uh, gobsmacked.
Yeah.
But then it made me dig a little bit further into the history of the negotiation of Treaty 8, and I saw how unjust and then when I researched specifically for Peyakow, I put down my pen for 6 months and just researched the historical context to delve even deeper into the history of Treaty 8. But working in that context, working deliberately within the federal government, and I chose that deliberately, was part of my strategy for my career, was to work at the local level in schools and the universities, colleges, and then work at the government level for the provincial government, then work at the federal level, and then go work for First Nations governments, which is kind of how it all unfolded. And when I was in the federal government, I just learned so much about how the federal system works.
Mhm.
And part of the reason I was able to stay in the job once I learned the context and what the negotiating mandate was of the federal government. There was a deal that had been negotiated, was almost concluded just before I went to work with the federal government, and that was the NISCA final agreement, which I ended up helping to translate, bringing the translation for that one to completion. Um, and the NISCA treaty, I thought, was a very good deal for everyone all around. And in part, it's credit. The NISCA people deserve credit because they were tough negotiators.
Yeah.
And they should have been, because they waited 100 years for the negotiations to start,
Yeah.
and they were brilliant strategists. But once I was there, I realized in government, and I really do believe that Indigenous people should work in government at all levels, including being, politicians and ministers, or in the case of the United States, secretaries with full and important portfolios, like your Secretary for the Interior right now.
Hmm.
That's wonderful and remarkable. I think it's Deb Haaland.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, that's phenomenal, and we need more of that throughout, to help us impact what happens to our people in the future. But I thought there could be a fair deal for other tribes, and I listened to the New Channel people who are brilliant, strategic negotiators and still warriors. They're phenomenal. I learned so much from them. But to listen to their vision of where they wanted to go, where they wanted to take their communities, and what they wanted their lives to be was so enlightening. And of course, I listened to the residential school experiences of many survivors, which brought me right back to my mother's story. However, I did think we could get a good deal with the New Child. However, within government, there's a very conservative element within the bureaucracy. This is before Stephen Harper's government, a conservative government, took over. Even under a liberal government, or a more democratic style government, the bureaucracy is incredibly conservative. And, we would negotiate, put all of our energy on all sides of the table to negotiate a meaningful deal. And that was always within our mandate, that we were the things we were allowed to, the extent we were allowed to go to make concessions. And but the conservative individuals within the federal government weren't even senior officials, really. They were medium level officials, which just block things and make it impossible to get a deal done. And so that stalled the process long enough until a conservative government took over, and they didn't dare shut down the process, but they just made it clear that there weren't going to be any deals while they were in power. And no deals really happened for the 8 years that conservative government was in power.
And the last part of that story that you talk about is your sort of new understanding of the word or the phrase vicarious liability.
Right.
Which I looked up, and then I went back through that chapter and thought about it again, and I felt like it was just it felt like a heartbreaking take, an idea for you to walk away from that experience with, after the time and work that went into it, and your position as a Indigenous Cree person in that field that you were working in. I felt like after you kind of had that realization, that idea of being a vicarious participant in those situations may have colored a lot of how you felt you moved through that space. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, so we negotiated, as strange as it sounds, the apology, and it was a profound, heartfelt, gut-wrenching apology, which was far more than I'd ever expected to achieve. Um, and again, full credit to the New Channel people, because they knew how to get that through. And they knew how to lobby the minister effectively and work existing political levers to make sure that their voices were heard at the highest levels of government, and that helped get it through. Um, but I went through that process, and I write about this dramatic day where I went to a meeting in Nanaimo, this beautiful town just north of here, north of where I am right now in British Columbia, and got this surprise from the chiefs, the Nuu chiefs. They were angry, and usually they were quite kind to me, even though we had difficult work and difficult situations. They were usually very conciliatory, and they knew I was working to get the best deal I could for them, and they appreciated it. But a private detective had been snooping around at their community, and interviewed a former school principal who was a great friends with the New Channel people. And the private eye just assumed, because he was a white guy, that he would divulge anything he knew. And unfortunately, they weren't looking, they weren't questioning survivors of the residential school and former staff of the residential school to try to bring justice to any wrongs that had been done there, to any crimes that had been committed. They were trying to limit the government's liability in a court case that was running concurrent with our negotiations. And so our negotiations concluded with that stunning apology, which I think is one of the milestones of my career. Um, and then 6 years later, I find out that the same lawyer who worked on that apology was representing the federal government in the court case. And I was really disappointed I was happy with the outcome of the court case. The plaintiffs were found to have complete credibility, and they won their case, but they were awarded relatively small amounts.
Not enough money, but the
And they had to pay their own
recognition.
legal,
Yeah.
yeah, they had to pay their own legal costs. And so I felt betrayed that I think there's at least a moral obligation on the part of the Department of Justice and the lawyer to tell us that they were using the same team
Yeah.
in a legal battle that they were using to negotiate. And so I felt used. And what it did for me, took that as a learning experience. So it made me much more cynical when negotiating deals, to always kind of look for ulterior motives
Yeah.
and try to understand and grasp the larger context, particularly when dealing with government.
Yeah. And that cynicism and then I'm going to try and weave this into another question, but the cynicism and the the pressure and stress and just kind of like weight that kind of career in those positions that you were working in put on you, along with as you've talked about, just generational ancestral trauma and stress from the events of 1899 and before and after and throughout this entire time, has led you to learn how to take care of yourself and how to move through the world in a way that is satisfactory for you and that helps you to continue to grow and do the work that you're doing. And one of the things that I also found as a universal thing, and it's also something I have heard in therapy, or it's similar, is when you said that the therapist you saw told you that you have an incredible drive to be healthy and a strong will to live a vibrant life. And the similar phrasing of it in the therapy I've done is finding ways to live a life worth living.
Hmm.
And so I saw a connection there, and I appreciated and loved seeing that. And I wondered how it felt for you to have that validation and recognition in that statement, what it felt like to hear that, and how it affected that the choices you made after hearing that, and how it helped you move forward.
Right. Well, that's another excellent question. The therapist I was seeing at the time, I was in a kind of a low in my life. I'd run into some career challenges. I was working at a university slash college and put in a leadership position over a team of non-Indigenous people. Even though our client group was intended to be Indigenous, the whole staff of the place was non-Indigenous, and I set about turning that around. And so I got a lot of back pushback from people. So I was at a low point, and I went for counseling. And the counselor, that wee bit of validation that he was able to see in me, that spark or that seed of something that wanted to grow into a healthy, vibrant being, was wonderfully validating. It was like he took this little seed that was, kind of languishing and gave it some water and some nutrition and helped it to blossom. And I've hung on to those words ever since.
Yeah.
Anytime I've hit a kind of a low point. And the cynicism I talked about earlier is a really healthy. It's part of that healthy outlook and vibrancy, because you learn how to sift through things and you learn to recognize what's good and what's not good. And you also
Absolutely.
just learn to speak your truth, to tell it like it is. In so many situations, in conversations, and people are so politically correct and polite, even though there's so much that goes unsaid that probably should be said.
Yeah.
And so I'm learning to speak the truth in any context and just tell it like it is, and cut through, you know, a lot of the nonsense. And that is healthy.
Yeah. And now that this chapter of your life has been written, and as a sequel to Mama Sketch, I'm hopeful that there is another story to tell. There's more story to tell, and that you're going to continue writing. I just wanted to briefly ask if you have a plan to continue recording the arc of your life and the amazing accomplishments that you have had throughout your time on this earth, because seeing that Mama Sketch is a coming of age and then you pick back up here at this part of your career, you are recording the past now, and I was curious if you're continuing to write and what you think about how that will sort of transform once you catch up to the present. and if you
Right.
are recording the present now, or how that kind of process is working for you.
Right. Well, I do something that I recommend everybody do, and that's I keep a journal.
Hmm.
And I started it as a healing mechanism. There's a wonderful book called The Artist's Way,
Yeah.
and it talks about a journaling process in there that's just wonderful. So I do that. And related to your question about what's next, and am I going to continue writing about my life, a dear friend of mine asked me that a couple of months ago, and I said, well, I think I have to do a little bit more living first before I write another memoir, that is.
Yeah.
Although, um, as people who've listened to me talk about the what's happened since Mama Scotch would would say or know, um, so much has happened since the release of
Mhm.
Mama Scotch in 2018 that I could write a book just about that,
That.
the reconciliation, etc. But I am I've been bitten by the bug of writing and music, the
Mhm.
creative bug, and it won't let go of me. I don't know how long this phase of my life is going to last. But I just had a meeting with my agent from Toronto via Zoom a couple weeks ago to talk about my writing plan because I want to work differently. I have a few mentors who I'm inspired by,
Mhm.
and one of my mentors, Caroline Adderson, works on about 4 projects at a time or maybe more. And she shifts between them. So she's usually writing a children's book, she's writing adult fiction, she might be writing a short story collection and recipe books.
Mhm.
And so I talked to my agent about what I'm going to be working on. And so I just sold the rights to my first novel in English for
Exciting.
North America. Yeah. And it's based, I mean, the premise is the young Cree man who goes from being a teacher in an affluent part of Vancouver to living on an Indian reserve. And so the premise is taken from the chapter called Yakucha in the book.
Mhm.
But that's, I just borrowed the premise. The rest is fictionalized, and
Yeah.
it's quite dramatic and a wonderful story arc. But I'm also going to work on a nonfiction book about Indigenous rights
Mhm.
in North America and maybe a bit beyond North America. And there's just a little side I wanted to say that I think you may have picked up on me talking about North America and not talking about Canada and the United
Yeah.
States. And it's part of the work that, in the research of Peyakow, and also from what I know about the legal lay of the land and the history of North America, that, you know, I'm dreaming of a time, and I like to go back to a time when the 49th parallel didn't constitute an international border that constrained Indigenous people.
Mhm.
And the United States respects a treaty called the Jay Treaty, where Indigenous Canadians have rights in the United States to work and live,
Mhm.
um, which is just wonderful. But Canada doesn't reciprocate and won't allow Indigenous Americans. But I dream about that. So I want to write about a bit more about that. And when I was invited to travel in Indonesia on a tour for Mama Scotch, not Indonesia, pardon me, Malaysia and Thailand. And it was the embassies of the Canadian embassies in those 2 countries who organized the tours. And in addition to the writing events, the writing and reading events, they had me meet with local Indigenous communities, leaders and analysts and just the people. And I was astonished at, it was a sideline in the tour, so I didn't spend a
Mhm.
lot of time and effort preparing for it because I just didn't have the time.
Yeah.
Um, and I was astonished how I could go on, um, for an hour or two talking about Indigenous rights in North America without any prep or
Mhm.
without any notes and hold people's attention. Like they were intrigued by everything I had to say.
Yeah.
And so I have to write about that. I absolutely have to write about that. And
You
then
do.
from my teaching career, I want to write some children's books as I love teaching kids and
Yeah.
I still, they're a hope. And youth, by the way, I think, are our hope for the future. I see so many young people who don't have the built-in biases that people my age have been socialized into believing, with racism and all that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
and religion and dogma, that sort of thing. So young people hope for the future. So children's books, and I want to work on a recipe book too because one of my very good friends is a cordon bleu chef. I think I write about her.
Uh-huh.
My friend Leah. We're still
Yes.
close friends, and we've dreamed about opening a place together, but now I'm dreaming about us writing a recipe book together, and I might apply for a grant for us to do that.
That would be
So that's the
wonderful.
writing plan for the future, those 4 or 5 things, yeah.
So many things to look forward to, and you mentioned it a little bit, and it was how I thought about starting with this because you start with it, but then I decided to move it to the end, which was John Fire Lame Deer's quote:
Oh, yeah.
"Love is something that you can leave behind you when you die. It is that powerful." And I I loved starting Peyakow with that mindset. Um, and so I was going to start talking with you about it, and then
Mm,
as I was getting myself situated, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna end with it.
yeah, yeah.
And I loved that very much, and it was very much a through line uh, through the book itself. And I don't know if you have any story about it in particular, or how it became meaningful for you the first time you heard it. Um, but I thought we could end
Hmm.
there.
Well, it's a beautiful way to end. And you've conducted a great interview, by the way, just phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for that. And that, when I read that quote, it just spoke to me so profoundly because that dynamic is what has kept me going. You know, the love of my great grandfather, Mushroom, who lived until I was about 9, his phenomenal, powerful love stays with me to this day. And the same for the love of my mother and my father, my great aunt Helen, who I read, she led the escape from the residential school in a
Mm-hmm.
chapter of Mama Scotch. Her beautiful, powerful love, my great grandmother, their love has stayed with me and buoyed me up and carried me through this difficult life that has been difficult in so many ways. And, when I write about living in exile in the opening part of the book, I wasn't trying to be dramatic. It's the truth.
Yeah.
That land where I was born and raised is idyllic and is a special place in my mind. And for many years, up until I was in my mid-30s, I used to dream about going back and dream about buying back sections of that land. So, but, you know, like I also said in that chapter, unfortunately, th- the land is not the land it was when I was there. It's the hub of the oil and gas industry in Canada. The Athabasca oil sands are right by there. So the land is transversed by, pipelines and compressor stations and pump jacks. Fortunately, that is being turned around a little bit, but not enough. But that quote, I put it in there too because at the beginning of the book, because it's the only powerful statement like that I've ever heard about love carrying on through generations,
Mm-hmm.
and not in some nostalgic kind of romantic way, but in a powerful, meaningful, substantial way.
It's
Um,
it's a statement that has life in it. You can
yeah,
you can feel that it has agency to it.
absolutely. It really, really does. Yeah.
Well, thank you again to Darrel J. McLeod for taking the time to talk to me today about Peyakow and so many other wonderful, important things that we all need to take more time to learn and read about. And thankfully, Darrel has a plan to help us with that, to continue writing for us. And you can order your very own copy of Peyakow at www.skylitbooks.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.